Captain Reg Adkins, your book, I Flew for MMA, is your life story as an airline pilot, and your fascination with flying started virtually at the beginning of your life. Living in Mount Lawley?
Yes, I was Mount Lawley, lived in Longroyd Street, and as far as I can remember, I was about 9 when I had my first thoughts of aviation. As I remember now, I actually had the first flight when I was 9 because I was sent up to Kalgoorlie to live with my auntie and uncle while my mother went to England. And I stayed there a year, and when I came home, they sent me home on what obviously been the airline's WA Dragon, I guess. And I was so looking forward to that flight. We taxied out across the field and took off. And the next thing I knew, there was a bump and we were on the ground at Mayland. So I relaxed so much I slept the whole way.
Did you watch what the crew was doing while you were awake?
No, I didn't. I can't remember anything about the flight except looking out the window and seeing it going along over the ground at Kalgoorlie and then hitting the ground, landing at Maylands, which was on the grass, and being a bit annoyed that I'd really missed it all.
You learned to fly at Maylands Aerodrome.
Yeah.
How did that come about? What were the circumstances leading up to that?
A bit like I said in the book, my mum bought me a little metal DC-3, DC-2, which I used to play with in the backyard in Longroyd Street. And then in about 38 or 39, I was about 13, we moved up of the road a bit. Then the aeroplanes you were coming over, this was the time when the Bungana and the DC-2s used to come across from Adelaide. And those days were pretty leisurely operation, and they would always fly over Maylands and over the city and out to the beach and back again to give the passengers a bit of a look. I mean, you don't do it these days because it's all money. It comes straight in. And we'd see this big glistening aeroplane droning over, and then we got the idea of, hey, let's go out to Maylands and have a look. So we jump on the bike, and some years ago I went back and measured it. I found it was from where we were living in Longroyd Street and Nanop Street to Maylands 3.5 miles.
And up
So
the
we used to
Guildford
jump
Road
on
Hill?
the 26-inch roadster and bore out there, and then we realised you had to be there when the aeroplane landed because that was the magic part, seeing this big bird come in and touch down.
That would have to be a 25-minute furious pedal to get there, wouldn't it?
I'm not going to try it again to time it. I did it in the car. I guess it would be, but we were pretty fit, you know, we all had bikes.
So by sometime in the 40s, decided that you were going to learn to fly. Can you remember that first day when you fronted at Maylands to learn to fly?
Yeah, I had wanted to be a pilot and join in the Air Force, of course, like everybody, but by the time I turned 18 in late 44, pilot training was over. So I joined the Air Force anyway, and I was an armourer, and I ended up in Japan with British Commonwealth Occupation Force, BCOF, and I was in 77 Squadron working on Mustangs, so I had 18 months with a love affair with Mustangs, and part of the armourer's duties was to sit in the cockpit and check all the switches, the bomb guns and armoury rocket switches, and for serviceability on the daily inspection. And I got used to sitting in that cockpit and have this play with this stick and like this with the throttle. And then I got been there a year and I got leave, and leave was pretty leisurely fair. You had a month, but you had the month from when you arrived in your home port until you had to leave again. So I had a 3-week trip on either the Manura, the Westralia or the Canimbla to Sydney, troop train across to Perth, leave started. And when I got home, 2 days, all the excitement was over, there's nothing to do. All my mates had gone, and because they couldn't get into aircrew, they all joined the Navy. So they were all sailing ships somewhere, nothing to do. And I was sitting in the lounge room reading a paper from cover to cover, the Daily News, because I was bored to tears. And then the classified, I got so desperate I was reading the classifieds. There's this little ad, learn to fly with the Royal Aero Club at Maylands. And we had a phone, and it was up there, and I thought, I just went like that, picked up the phone, rang up. This guy said, sure, why don't you come out? I said, well, when, you know, can I make it? He said, do it now, come out now. So my old bike was still hanging up in the rafters, and I got it down, pumped up the tyres, and went out there. He put me in the Tiger Moth that afternoon, and I said, yes, please, and I started the next day. And because I had 28 days leave, and I took to it like a duck to water, I just flew every day that I could, sometimes 3, 4 periods in a day. And before the 28 days leave was up, I had a private pilot licence.
So you must have imagined that moment right from probably the first time you sat in the seat of a Mustang or one of those other aircraft.
Well, you didn't dare to dream in the Mustang because you were in the Air Force. I was an LAC, leading aircraftsman, and it was just something that was way out of an airman's depth. An airman, we were all airmen, but we didn't fly aeroplanes. But it probably gave me that, that was sitting there in the back of my mind.
So, operating from Maylands and under instruction, people have mentioned that Maylands had some peculiarities. For example, there's a levee bank at one end of the aerodrome and some chimneys from the brickworks at the other end. Did that present any difficulties for students like yourself at that stage?
No, there were chimneys at both ends, as a matter of fact. The cement works factories where the dome is now.
Oh, yes.
They were the biggest. The brickworks were back to the northwest and they weren't anywhere near as high. The levee bank was there to keep the water out, the Swan River, but you aimed to miss the chimneys whichever way you went, and the instructor made sure, what's one of the first things you learn is to keep straight. And he would put the fear into you, of course, by saying you wouldn't want to hit those chimneys because they're going to make an awful mess of you. And so you learnt to miss them. But later on, when I was an instructor, I'm ashamed to say I learnt the first time the hard way about density altitude, because there was a flying down to Busselton. We had a wing at Busselton, and that was in 1950, 51. And we're all moving down for a big air show, in which they actually had Mustangs down there that day. And I had a girlfriend who was not the one I'm married to, and she was fairly well built, and the aeroplane was full of all the tie-down gear, chocks and stakes and overnight gear. And we took off from must have been a hot day, probably February, and we took off heading towards the chimneys, and 3/4 of the way with the tail up, we weren't going anywhere. And I thought, I don't think I'm going to clear this levee bank. I mean, it wasn't that high, it wasn't that high. But I didn't have the brains to stop, or we didn't have brakes or anything in those days. And I just actually managed to get the wheels over the top of this levee bank. And because it was a race and we never got anywhere. We were so slow, we just chugged along. So yes, there were a few hazards there, but the worst one was taking off to the northeast towards Rivervale, the big bank and the houses there, but we didn't often do that.
I noticed that when I was a kid, because I grew up part of the time in Maylands, and you describe as the white picket fence at Maylands Aerodrome, and by the time I was there hanging over that same fence, it was cyclone wire. But we used to notice that aeroplanes arriving from the northwesterly direction over the clay pits, there seemed to be a fair amount of sink just before the fence, and you'd often hear the engine revs go up to get you over the fence before the touchdown.
Yeah, well, the fence in my time was white rail and didn't have wire on it. It just had 2 rails and posts, and you could, if you were small, you could stand on the bottom rail and lean over the top, or you could sit on it. But the clay pit was more of a psychological problem than anything, because the pit was very deep. They always said you can land slowly and not burn up, but it's different if you're going to dive in the pit and drown. And if you got a bit undershooting a bit, that was where the power came on to help you get back over the fence.
And you learned to fly in de Havilland Tiger Moth?
Yes.
Do you remember obviously you would remember your first solo. Can you tell us about that?
All I can remember about it is my instructor was Harold Vassey. Red Vassey had been an RAF fighter pilot, flew Typhoons, pretty hot ship, and he later was killed in the crash of MMA at Guildford in 1949. But he was a taciturn sort of a guy, and he used to tell me what he needed to tell me. He didn't have all this nonsense about theory of flight and all that in those days.
This is staying up, is it?
Well, you tell you what you need to know to learn to fly.
Right.
To learn to fly. And he obviously one day in a Tiger Moth, the instructor sits in the front, as you know, and he's got a mirror up on the left cabane strut where he's got your face in this sight. and he just watches you, and you can see by your facial expression and your eyes, your mouth, how you're going.
Abject terror.
Anyway, he sent me off, and we was northerlies blowing, so he took off into the north, virtually over the clay pits going the other way. I can't remember anything about it except when I was levelled out, flying downwind at 1,000 feet, doing everything I'd been taught, and a pretty intense instruction, probably only a week after I started to learn to fly. And I can see it today going down, I can see the river down there, I can see the East Perth powerhouse and the gasometer down there. And I suddenly became aware that was no head in the front seat, because all you ever saw was that, you know, these goggles and helmet.
Yeah.
And it was then and only then, and that's the only thing I remember, God, there's nobody in the front seat. What am I going to do now? I just made a landing.
That's a great story, and I think one of the things that I remember, Malcolm Yeo probably remembers as well, that the aeroplane on the first solo, when it rotated, sprang into the air because it was so much lighter. And
That's right.
it's a bit I wasn't expecting.
Well, they didn't tell you things like that, really. But the thing was just fly the aeroplane. Fly it and trim it and keep the speeds and keep straight.
In reading your book, I get a sense of great respect and great affection for Douglas DC-3.
Yes, definitely.
Now, what was it like to fly the DC-3?
Well, it's hard to remember. You know, I enjoyed it. It was hard work because we worked hard. You know, in the initial part, we used to do all the loading and the unloading, as well as fly the aeroplane, which the further north you went, the hotter it got, and you were sweating like a pig all day. And some of those days there in the Kimberleys, we did 13 landings in a day. But I haven't got any remembrance of hating it. I never ever hated a day sitting in that aeroplane, and I can remember coming home at night. They used to fly the DC-3 home from Glenroy at Air Beef Friday night after the last trip for maintenance, when the aeroplane needed some big maintenance, so a crew would fly it home. We'd fly it all the way from Glenroy through Derby, Broome, the quickest way we could over Whitney to Perth. It had no autopilot in because they stripped everything out so they could carry more beef. And I can just remember sitting there in the middle of the night, I'll get all teary in a minute, in under the stars, trimmed out, lights down low, probably the other guy asleep, and just two fingers, a finger and a thumb, and arms on the armrest, perfectly relaxed this big leather seat. And this aeroplane just droning on. Great.
Yeah, and you'd reached that dream point. That was the ultimate.
So, Reg, you'd actually gone back to your first flight where you slept most of the way.
One would have a nap for a while. I mean, it was a long flight. It was, I think it was 9 hours from Glenroy to Perth, and no autopilot, so you had to have a bit of a break.
You made the transition from Tiger Moths to the DC-3. That's quite a large step. And I wonder how you coped with that, or you just didn't think about it, you just flew the aeroplane like you were told, I suppose.
Well, as I've said a few times, I can't remember the first year, really. I can remember doing the ground course, and I can remember being out over Bass Strait every now and again in the dark and the rain and the sleets. But it was going from a Tiger Moth with a basic aeroplane to an aeroplane with retractable gear, constant speed props, big 1200 horsepower, radio, dual controls, autopilot. It was just mind-boggling. These days, nothing like that ever happens. You transition like they did in the Air Force from the Tiger to either the Harvard or the Anson, and you got the rudimentaries of all those things before you went on to a big operational aeroplane. So it'd be nice if some psychiatrist would get in my head and bring it all out, because I really can't remember much about it.
That's interesting how
It's
that...
probably the shock of coming from sitting in the outside to being able to sit inside an aeroplane.
That's right. I mean, I can remember things like going to crewing and getting a roster and being in the lounge at A&A's big building in Essendon Aerodrome, and when you were off duty or if you're on standby, you'd sit up there in these big windows and look at all the aeroplanes, DC-3s and DC-4s lined up. I can remember all that, but I can't really recall sitting in the aeroplane much.
It's part of your life.
And you didn't get any more takeoffs or landings either, you know.
No.
Here's this kid, straight out of the aircraft.
What would he do?
He's not going to have my aeroplane to crash.
You talked about the Air B scheme and thinking about Wyndham. You also flew those big Bristol freighters at one stage, didn't you?
In A&A, I didn't fly them. It was a single pilot aeroplane because it was only a freighter, and all the guys are all ex-wartime, so they used to single pilot operation anyway. But the FO was there as a radio operator.
All right.
And it was the cockpit seam was as wide as this room, and the pilot was right over there. I think I've said.
You said that in the book.
And
yes.
you think, God, if you ever had a heart attack, what would I do?
How would I get there?
But you used to sit there and rattle away on the key and out over Bass Strait.
What about the transition when you moved from the piston engine aircraft to the turboprops?
That was really magic. We lost our great mentor, Dave John, a while ago. He introduced us to the gas turbine and also the turboprop, the propeller for the Rolls-Royce Dart. And stepping out of the DC-3 into the F27 was just made our world. Just finally, at last, we're starting to catch up with the rest of the world. Guys that had left us in 1956 and gone overseas were flying DC-8s and all that stuff. And finally, at last, we got a decent modern aeroplane, air-conditioned, shirt sleeves job, collar and tie, hot buffet, hostess to give you a hot cup of tea, and all this top-class gear, propellers, a jet engine driving the propeller was great.
And MMA was quite happy to stay with Fokker and go from the F27 to the F28.
In '69, Reg Adkins actually bought the F28s. I suppose he would have conferred with MMA because at that stage he hadn't really gained full control. He might have just about 69. So I consider him the one that gave us the chance to fly the jet. So they had such a good run with the F27 with Fokker, such a good aeroplane, a solid aeroplane. How could they go past that? And they didn't want the bigger DC-9, which really wasn't a license to operate on those northwest strips. So the F28 was built for that.
What were the big changes when you went to the jets? Was it so much faster? Did that increase the workload for the pilot?
The speed was the killer. It wasn't a killer, but it was the thing that was the hardest to cope with. F28 was travelling at 4 times the speed of the DC-3, and whereas it used to take us 6 hours to get from Perth to Headland with a stop at Meekatharra in the DC-3, now it was non-stop in an hour and 50 minutes in the jet, and so your workload quadrupled really. You had to think fast. The flying the aeroplane itself was great with the real boot in the back when you opened the throttles. And if it was empty and it was lightly loaded, you took off in the middle of the winter, it'd just go mad, it'd just scream for height so fast and so much performance. But the speed, trying to keep up with it was the big thing, very hard. Took a lot of concentration for the mental discipline.
And by that time a lot of study too to keep abreast of the engineering that went with that.
Don't talk about the manuals. Manuals are as thick as a doorstop and you had to know every page of it.
Now you're a unique, amongst a unique group of captains that had your son fly as a first officer with you.
No, he didn't.
Oh, he didn't?
No. He actually joined ANZST and he was ANZST New South Wales, and then he got a posting to Perth, and he joined the company the same month as I retired. But he was on F27s, I was on F28s. But we actually both got our name on the monthly pilot's roster on my last month.
So that's quite an achievement. That he followed in your footsteps. And
when I did my final flight, it was traditional for the family to go with them, and they gave you a decent flight, day flight. Group captain's hours, 10 o'clock departure or something. And he should knock on the door, but Alwyn in his full uniform. They flew him over from New South Wales for it.
We're talking with Captain Reg Adkins, and this is a centenary cavalcade of flight. Captain Adkins, the northwest of Western Australia was a unique theatre for flying aeroplanes, wasn't it? Nowhere else in the world would you get those sorts of conditions.
That's right. There was, as I said in my book, there's only 2 seasons up there, the wet and the dry. and the dry is magical. Clear blue skies for 6 months a year, cold at night, so you pull a blanket up when you're asleep, and in the daytime shirt sleeves and just balmy conditions, and along comes the wet season and along come the thunderstorms, and it's an entirely different kettle of fish, and you're fighting your way through towering thunderheads and turbulence, and in the DC3 days it was murder because you were flying right through the middle of them. In the F27 days we thought we were getting on top, but we were flying through the tops of them, which was pretty well even worse. And even in the F28 days you could get up to 32, 33,000 if you were light. They were still up there, and so, but you had the choice of going round them then because there weren't that many of them.
Is it true that the DC3 front window, the windscreen if you like, somebody told me that was corked around the side? It was a flat pane of glass, as I understand it, which would sit out on the tarmac hot and dry during the hot season, and then the first time it rained would leak fairly proficiently.
No, I can't remember ever been in a leaky DC3. We had good engineers, kept them all stocked up all the time.
Yeah, and I read that they were always highly polished, and that made MMA a different airline to most of them.
MMA used to purchase Duraglit, wadding, polishing wadding. They used to purchase it in 5-pound tins, and every time it was in for overnight maintenance, the cleaners, and they were a regular part of the company, used to get to work on part of the aeroplane and get this polish out. And I know how hard it is because I've got a few of these metal models that I collect, and I polish them, and your arm just aches after half an hour, and these guys used to polish away half the night.
It was a little bit like the Sydney Harbour Bridge, where they would start polishing one end of the aeroplane, and
pretty well,
each time it was in the hangar, and gradually keep it right up to speed.
Pretty well, yeah.
You made reference in your book to Captain Sid Goddard that took one aircraft to the east, and people remarked on the shiny,
how well kept it was. Yeah. So I don't know whether Ansett, ANA and TA, I don't know what they did with theirs, how clean theirs was, but they obviously weren't as clean and shiny as ours were. People wouldn't have noticed it.
No. How many DC3s were there in the fleet that had to be kept polished?
I think I'll say 7 or 8 there. I can't remember offhand.
Reg, flying in the conditions up north in the wet with all the thunderstorms, one would imagine that there was always the chance of lightning strikes. Was it just the chance, or did you get struck by lightning?
I only ever got struck by lightning once, and that was in ANA, between Melbourne and Adelaide. And we were flying along, obviously, in the thunderstorms, because they said to fly in the thunderstorm, the DC3, you should be halfway between the ground and the base of the thunderstorm. And the average base was accepted as 8,000 to 10,000 feet, so in that case you should really be flying at 4,000 to 5,000. That was just something that didn't work too well up the northwest with MMA, because the lower safe altitude over the Hammersleys was 5,000 feet. But this night from Adelaide to Melbourne to Adelaide, we did get hit, and it was an almighty, God almighty bang, and a flash right in front of us. And my initial feeling was the nose is going to come off this thing, and we're just going to go fall out like that. I mean, I'd only been flying DC3s for a year, and I was a bit of a shock, but that was the only time I ever was struck by lightning.
What was the effect on the aircraft? Obviously the nose didn't come off.
Nothing. We just kept going, and we landed at Adelaide and said, oh boy, we got struck by lightning. Well, I don't know whether they did lightning checks in those days, but in the F27 days, Brian Bailey was struck in an F27 between Meekatharra and Headland. And when he got there and they did a check of the aeroplane, there was a little row of static discharge burn holes right along the bottom of the fuselage from front to back, and Fokker got onto that straight away and realised that the aircraft hadn't been thoroughly bonded against static electricity.
Captain Adkins, thank you for talking with us. The book's called I Flew for MMA. Pilots and aspiring pilots are going to find it fascinating reading, as we all did, and we've been talking to its author, Captain Reg Adkins. Reg, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure.